My name is Charlotte, and I am 31 years old. Last Christmas Eve, my mother screamed in my face because a 15-pound holiday brisket was not in the smoker yet. She called me a useless disappointment in front of 25 guests, expecting me to lower my head and apologize. She treated me like an unpaid servant. She had no idea I spent my nights building a boutique supply chain software firm valued at $4 million. I kept my wealth a secret because I knew my family would drain every cent to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. But standing in that kitchen, covered in beef blood and cracked pepper, I finally snapped. I took a corporate call confirming a $2 million contract, dropped my stained apron onto her raw meat, announced my net worth, and walked out the front door. The voicemail she left me hours later shocked even my lawyer. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your age, your location, and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Welcome to Sofia Told Stories. Now let me take you back to a sprawling granite kitchen in Southlake, Texas, and the exact moment my family's pristine illusion shattered across the hardwood floor. The air inside my parents' estate smelled of expensive pine candles and suffocating tension. Hosting a flawless holiday dinner in this neighborhood dictates your social standing for the rest of the year. I stood at the kitchen island, my hands slick with cold animal fat trimming the edge of a massive cut of beef. I wore a faded floral apron serving as the unofficial domestic help while my family entertained early arrivals. In the adjoining living room, my sister Savannah lounged on a velvet sofa, holding a mimosa. Her husband Bradley stood by the fireplace, holding court. He wore custom leather boots and a slick, practiced smile, boasting to my father about a recent, supposedly lucrative oil strike out in the Permian Basin. He promised endless returns, swirling top-shelf bourbon in a crystal glass. I kept my head down, working the knife through the meat. A few minutes later, the doorbell chimed. A local delivery driver stood on the porch holding a stack of warming trays containing the catered side dishes. Bradley strutted over to play the generous host, pulling a sleek black credit card from his money clip. The driver swiped it through a mobile reader. "Declined," the driver said, his voice flat and bored. Bradley let out a tight, forced chuckle, blaming fraud protection and the busy holiday shopping season. He handed over a second card. Declined again. A muscle twitched in his jaw. A drop of sweat traced a path down his temple. He dug out a third worn plastic card, which finally approved the transaction. He tipped the driver quickly and shut the door, glancing around to see if anyone noticed the humiliation. I saw it all from the kitchen island, filing that financial red flag away in my mind. My mother Suzanne paced the hallway. She paused to wipe a microscopic smudge off the ornate gold frame of her prized Frederick Remington painting, the crown jewel of her socialite facade. Then her sharp gaze landed on me. "Charlotte, you are moving like molasses," she snapped, marching into the kitchen. "The meat is sitting on the counter. The silver requires another polish. Do you want the guests to think we live in a barn?" Before I could formulate a response, my phone vibrated in the front pocket of my jeans. I wiped a bloody finger on the floral apron and pulled the device out. The caller ID showed David, my chief operating officer. I pressed answer, lifting the phone to my ear. "The logistics contract is signed," David said, his voice buzzing with adrenaline over the speaker. $2 million annual recurring revenue. "The ink is dry, Charlotte." Suzanne slapped her hand flat against the granite counter. "Who are you talking to?" she shrieked. "Hang that up immediately and get this meat outside. You are embarrassing me." I looked at my mother. I looked at Savannah, scrolling lazily on her phone, and at Bradley, sweating through his designer shirt over a basic catering bill. The invisible chains I had worn for a decade simply dissolved into the dry winter air. "Good work, David," I said into the receiver, ignoring my mother entirely. "Process the payroll bonuses." I hung up the phone. I reached behind my neck and untied the apron strings. I let the stained fabric fall directly onto the raw, bloody brisket. "What are you doing?" Suzanne gasped, her eyes widening in shock. "I run a supply chain software firm valued at $4 million, I said, my voice eerily steady, cutting through the holiday music playing in the background. "I just closed a $2 million contract. I am not your maid, Suzanne. Hire a chef." I turned on my heel and headed for the front door. Suzanne lunged after me, grabbing my elbow with surprising force. "You ungrateful brat, you cannot leave us like this," she hissed. I jerked my arm out of her grip. The sudden movement sent me stumbling backward into the hallway console table. My shoulder collided with a towering, meticulously stacked display of expensive vintage glass ornaments. The structure tipped. Dozens of hand-blown glass spheres crashed onto the Texas hardwood, shattering into a million glittering, jagged shards. The sharp noise silenced the entire house. Bradley dropped his bourbon glass. Savannah screamed. I did not apologize. I stepped right through the sea of broken glass, my boots crunching the shards into fine powder, and walked out into the crisp December evening. I got into my car and drove straight toward the airport, a first-class ticket to Miami already booked on my phone. I felt an intoxicating, breathless freedom. But I did not know that my escape was about to intersect with a digital alarm one that would expose a quiet, devastating theft happening right under our noses. The drive from Southlake to the airport took 30 minutes, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made it feel like seconds. My phone buzzed relentlessly against the center console. I glanced at the screen, catching a glimpse of the notifications. Savannah was calling me repeatedly. My sister, the golden child, who had never lifted a finger to help with a holiday meal, was panicking. I let the phone ring. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, staring at the raw brisket, realizing the domestic servant she mocked was currently driving toward the highway, leaving her to deal with the wrath of 25 hungry guests. The petty satisfaction tasted like vintage champagne. I arrived at the airport navigating the sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of the terminals. It was Christmas Eve, and the concourses were packed with travelers. Families dragged massive suitcases. Men in cowboy boots checked departure screens, and stressed airline employees herded passengers through security checkpoints. The ambient noise, the rolling luggage, the loud announcements over the intercom washed over me. I moved through the crowd feeling a strange new lightness in my step. For the first time in 31 years, I was completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating expectations of my family. I cleared security and walked toward my gate. I bought a double espresso sitting near the large plate glass windows watching the planes taxi across the tarmac. The sun was setting, casting a deep orange glow over the tarmac. I had built my software company in the shadows, typing code until 3 in the morning while my parents slept. I hid my success because I knew exactly how they operated. My mother viewed money as a social weapon to secure her status, and Savannah viewed it as an endless resource to fund her vanity. If they knew I was a millionaire, they would have demanded I finance Bradley's risky oil ventures or cover Savannah's designer shopping habits. Hiding the money was an act of pure survival. But tonight, the secret was out, and the fallout was no longer my problem. I boarded the flight, settling into seat 2A. The spacious first-class cabin offered a quiet refuge from the holiday madness outside. I pulled my laptop from my leather tote bag, intending to review the final details of the $2 million contract David had just closed. I connected to the aircraft's wireless network, opening my secure corporate dashboard. The screen did not display the contract files. Instead, a bright red security banner flashed across the top of my dashboard. My proprietary supply chain software includes an aggressive cybersecurity protocol designed to track and flag unusual digital traffic connected to my primary server. Because I occasionally worked from my parents' house during the holidays, their home internet protocol address was whitelisted in my system. The security alert flagged a massive data anomaly originating from that specific whitelisted address. I frowned, setting my espresso down on the small tray table. I typed in my administrative override codes, digging into the raw data log. Someone had just used the secure network connection at my parents' house in Southlake to bypass standard banking firewalls. They had initiated 3 sequential wire transfers. The sums were staggering, totaling nearly $400,000. The funds were routed through a series of domestic shell companies before disappearing into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold, creeping dread replacing the triumphant adrenaline. My father, Richard, was a retired corporate engineer. He was careful, methodical, and deeply conservative with his retirement savings. He did not execute massive wire transfers on Christmas Eve to offshore accounts. He did not know how to bypass a banking firewall. But I knew someone in that house who did. I thought about Bradley standing by the fireplace bragging about his massive oil strikes in the Permian Basin. I thought about the sweat dripping down his temple when his credit cards declined paying for a simple catering order. The math snapped into a horrifying, undeniable focus. Bradley was not a successful oil and gas speculator waiting on drilling permits. He was broke. He was a parasite draining his father-in-law's retirement accounts to float his own sinking investments. He was using the holiday gathering, the chaos of the dinner party, to sneak onto the home network and steal the money while everyone else was distracted. How do you celebrate your freedom when you suddenly realize your family is being robbed blind? Do you order a cocktail and fly to Miami, or do you turn around and stop the bleeding? My phone vibrated again. Another call from Savannah. I ignored it, swiping the notification away. I was not going to answer her complaints about a ruined party while her husband was actively committing wire fraud. I needed to isolate the destination of the stolen funds. I needed to lock down the routing numbers before the money disappeared completely. I started typing furiously, my fingers flying across the keyboard, running a secondary trace through my software architecture. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted, cutting through my intense concentration. I looked up. A flight attendant was standing next to my seat, offering a polite, strained smile. "We are preparing for takeoff. I need you to close your laptop and turn your phone to airplane mode immediately." I stared at her, the panic and the urgency boiling over into a sudden, hostile reaction. "I cannot turn this off right now," I snapped, my voice sharp and loud, drawing the attention of the passengers across the aisle. "This is an active security breach. You need to give me 5 minutes." The flight attendant's smile vanished. "Ma'am, federal aviation regulations require all large electronics to be stowed. If you do not comply, we will have to return to the gate and remove you from the aircraft." I looked at her uniform, then at the glowing red alert on my screen. I was acting like an entitled jerk, lashing out at an innocent woman doing her job because I was terrified for the father I had just abandoned. The brilliant CEO, the woman who had just dramatically claimed her independence, was throwing a tantrum in seat 2A. I slammed my laptop shut, shoving it roughly into my tote bag. I snatched my phone and switched it to airplane mode, my hands shaking with a mix of fury and profound, helpless anxiety. "I apologize," I muttered, refusing to make eye contact, staring out the small oval window. The plane pushed back from the gate, the heavy engines roaring to life. The physical sensation of moving forward, leaving Dallas behind, felt entirely wrong. I was flying toward a tropical vacation, but my mind was chained to the digital theft occurring in the living room I had just left. I spent the entire 3-hour flight staring at the dark screen of my phone, calculating how quickly I could freeze my father's accounts the moment we landed in Florida. I assumed the biggest hurdle would be navigating the banking bureaucracy from a different time zone. I planned to call Richard and expose Bradley's fraud, destroying the golden son-in-law's reputation before sunrise. But the revenge I was planning would be entirely derailed by a tragic biological reality. When the plane finally touched down in Miami and my phone reconnected to the cellular network, a single voicemail from my mother would shatter my anger, replacing it with a devastating, crushing guilt that would force me to abandon my freedom and return straight into the fire. The flight from Dallas to Miami felt like suspended animation. I sat rigid in my spacious first-class seat, ignoring the complimentary champagne and the warm nuts. My mind raced, running algorithms and tracing digital pathways, attempting to calculate how Bradley had accessed my father's accounts. I planned the exact sequence of my retaliation. The moment the tires hit the tarmac, I would call my corporate attorneys, freeze the offshore routing numbers, and expose the parasite feeding on my family. I was ready to drop a financial guillotine on my brother-in-law and watch my mother's precious socialite illusion crumble into dust. The heavy plane banked over the glittering Florida coastline and began its descent. The landing gear engaged with a mechanical thud. As we taxied toward the gate, I reached into my tote bag and switched off airplane mode. I expected my phone to explode with a barrage of angry texts from Savannah. I expected long, furious paragraphs from my mother, accusing me of ruining her reputation in front of the neighborhood guests. My phone vibrated, but the screen did not display a wall of angry text messages. It showed a single notification. One new voicemail from Suzanne. I waited until the cabin doors opened, grabbing my bag and joining the stream of passengers exiting the aircraft. The Miami air hit me the moment I stepped onto the jet bridge. It was humid, thick, and smelling faintly of jet fuel and salt water, a stark, disorienting contrast to the dry, biting winter chill I had left behind in North Texas. I navigated the bustling terminal, walking toward the baggage claim while dialing my voicemail inbox. I pressed the phone to my ear, bracing myself for my mother's familiar, screeching reprimands. The recording clicked on. The voice that filled my ear did not belong to the commanding Southlake matriarch who had screamed at me about unpolished silver. It was a raw, broken sound, a guttural weeping that stripped away every ounce of her curated elegance. "Charlotte," she sobbed, her voice cracking, pulling in ragged, uneven breaths. "He fell. Your father fell right after you left. He was trying to pick up the broken ornaments, and he just collapsed. He could not talk. The left side of his face was drooping. The paramedics said it is a massive stroke. We are at Baylor Medical Center. Please, please, Charlotte, he is in surgery, and I do not know what to do. Please, come back." The recording ended. The automated prompt offered to save or delete the message, but I could not move my finger to press a key. I stood frozen in the middle of the crowded Miami airport, the humid air suddenly feeling suffocating. People rushed past me, dragging rolling suitcases, laughing and calling out to relatives. The festive, tropical holiday atmosphere clashed violently with the horrifying reality echoing in my brain. My father, the quiet, retired engineer who spent his evenings reading historical biographies and avoiding my mother's high society drama, he had collapsed in the hallway, standing amidst the shattered glass of the vintage ornaments I had deliberately destroyed. If your dramatic exit caused your father to suffer a stroke, could you ever forgive yourself? If the very act of claiming your freedom triggered a medical emergency that might kill the only parent who ever showed you a shred of kindness, how do you live with the consequences? The adrenaline that fueled my escape evaporated, instantly replaced by a crushing, gut-wrenching guilt. I had staged a theatrical exit. I had dropped the apron, announced my wealth, and walked out intending to punish them for treating me like a maid. I wanted to make a point. Instead, the stress of the argument, the screaming match, the physical destruction of the ornaments had pushed an aging man over the edge. I had traded his life for a moment of petty vindication. I stumbled toward a row of empty chairs near the baggage carousel, dropping heavily onto a plastic seat. My hands were shaking so violently, I nearly dropped my phone. I pulled up my airline application, frantically searching for the next available flight back to Dallas-Fort Worth. It was Christmas Eve. The outgoing flights were fully booked, packed with holiday travelers. The earliest available seat was a red-eye, leaving at 5 in the morning, arriving in Texas just after sunrise on Christmas Day. I booked the ticket without checking the price. the $4 million valuation of my company feeling entirely useless and hollow against the terrifying biological frailty of my father's heart. I secured a room at an airport hotel, a sterile, generic space designed for transient layovers. I dragged my designer suitcase into the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, isolating me in a quiet box overlooking the glowing tarmac. I did not unpack. I did not turn on the television. The crushing weight of my guilt demanded a physical release. I grabbed the handle of my heavy suitcase and hurled it across the room. It crashed into the luggage rack, sliding off and hitting the floor with a loud thud. I turned toward the drywall separating the sleeping area from the bathroom. I let out a raw, frustrated scream and kicked the wall with all the force I could muster. The impact sent a sharp, agonizing pain shooting up my leg, bruising my heel instantly. I stumbled backward, dropping onto the edge of the stiff hotel bed, clutching my foot, tears of shame and panic streaming down my face. I cursed myself out loud, my voice cracking in the empty room. I cursed the pride that made me smash the ornaments. I cursed the stubborn refusal to just endure one more holiday dinner. I spent the next 6 hours pacing the small room, staring out the window at the flashing lights of the airport runways, waiting for the sun to rise. I did not sleep. I mentally prepared myself for the hostility I would face when I arrived at the hospital. I assumed Suzanne would blame me entirely for the stroke. I expected Savannah to hurl accusations in the waiting room, treating me like a murderer who had abandoned the family. I braced myself for a brutal emotional war, believing I deserved every insult they would throw at me. But when I finally walked through the sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit the following morning, the formidable, hostile family I expected to fight was nowhere to be found. The reality waiting for me in that sterile hospital corridor was far more complex and devastating. The confrontation would not unfold as a screaming match over a ruined holiday. It would begin with a shocking confession from my mother, completely exonerating my dramatic exit while revealing a hidden, terrifying truth about Bradley's financial parasitism, forcing me to navigate my first massive obstacle in the fight to save my parents' future. The revelation regarding the durable power of attorney shifted the entire landscape of the conflict. I could not simply march into a bank branch and freeze my father's assets. Bradley held the legal high ground, insulated by the very documents designed to protect vulnerable adults. If I wanted to sever his access, I needed irrefutable proof of his fraud. I needed leverage that superseded a probate court ruling. I left my mother sleeping fitfully in an uncomfortable waiting room chair and drove straight to my corporate office in the Dallas Design District. My company occupied a converted warehouse space, the exposed brick and polished concrete floors, a stark contrast to the sterile medical environment I had just escaped. I bypassed my desk, walking directly to the server room. I booted up my primary workstation, pulling the raw data logs from the offshore wire transfers I had flagged on the airplane. The initial pattern of withdrawals suggested a classic embezzlement scheme. Large sums of cash moved quickly and quietly, often structured just below the reporting thresholds required by federal banking regulations. My initial theory, the most common explanation for a slick Dallas broker bleeding cash, was an expensive, hidden affair. I expected to find the money flowing to luxury apartments or high-end jewelers. The reality I uncovered, buried deep in the financial architecture, was far more dangerous and complex. I utilized a proprietary tracking module designed by my software firm, a tool meant to trace global supply chain logistics to follow the money. The funds were not paying for a secret mistress. They were being funneled into a network of shell companies registered in Midland and Odessa, the heart of the Permian Basin oil patch. The Permian Basin operates on a boom-and-bust culture where aggressive speculators sell empty promises on handshake deals and fortunes evaporate overnight. I accessed public drilling registries and cross-referenced the coordinates listed on Bradley's LLC filings. The data revealed a horrifying truth. He did not own lucrative producing oil wells. He owned hundreds of acres of dry, useless scrubland. The leases had been dormant for years, producing nothing but dust and tumbleweeds. But the dry leases were only half the equation. The rest of my father's stolen retirement funds were routed directly to a prominent white-collar criminal defense firm in Houston. Bradley was paying massive retainers to federal tax attorneys. The picture snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. Bradley was not waiting on drilling permits. He was running an affinity scam, a classic Ponzi scheme targeting his own family and his wealthy social circle in Southlake. He used new money from investors like my father to pay fake returns to older investors, floating the illusion of a massive strike. But the scheme was collapsing. The IRS, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, had caught his scent, and he was draining Richard's accounts to pay for his legal defense before the federal indictments came down. Would you use your own company's proprietary tech to illegally dig up dirt on your brother-in-law? Would you risk corporate liability to prove a man is a fraud? I did not hesitate. The moral ambiguity of using my software to hack into his public filings felt entirely justified against the backdrop of my father lying in a coma. But I needed physical proof. I needed the fraudulent prospectus he used to lure his investors. I needed the document tying him to the dry leases to present to a judge. I picked up my phone and dialed Bradley's number. He answered on the second ring, the arrogant confidence already back in his voice. "Charlotte," he purred, the smooth southern drawl grating against my nerves. "Your mother said you came back from Miami. I am glad you decided to act like family during this difficult time." I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, adopting the tone of a naive, eager investor. "I am sorry about the scene on Christmas Eve, Bradley," I lied, forcing a nervous laugh. "I was stressed about the buyout. Listen, I just finalized a major contract. My company is highly liquid right now, and I am sitting on a significant amount of dead cash. I know you mentioned those Permian leases to Dad. I was hoping I could review your prospectus. I am looking for an aggressive tax shelter." The silence on the other end of the line was brief but telling. His greed instantly overrode his suspicion. Bradley viewed me as a cash machine, a socially awkward spinster who had stumbled into money and needed a man to manage it. "That is incredibly smart, Charlotte," he said, his tone shifting into full salesman mode. "The Permian is booming. I have a highly confidential prospectus outlining our next major drill site. I can email it to you this afternoon, but we need to move fast. The buy-in window closes next week." "Send it over," I replied, hanging up the phone before I broke character. The bait was set, but the adrenaline of the hunt combined with the sheer exhaustion of a red-eye flight and the emotional trauma of the ICU was degrading my professional restraint. I walked out of my office and into the main bullpen area where my software engineers were typing furiously, attempting to finalize the code for our new client. I noticed a minor discrepancy on the main testing monitor, a slight lag in the data processing speed. It was a routine coding error, easily fixed with a few keystrokes. But my frayed nerves snapped. "What is this?" I yelled, slamming my hand onto the engineer's desk, startling him so badly he dropped his stylus. "The processing speed is lagging by 2 milliseconds. Do you think a $2 million client pays us for lagging data? Fix this immediately or find another job." The entire bullpen went dead silent. The engineers stared at me, their eyes wide with shock. I had never raised my voice in the office. I had built a culture of quiet, collaborative competence. I was projecting the toxic, demanding behavior of my mother, the aggressive bullying of my brother-in-law, onto innocent employees who were just doing their jobs. I stared at the frightened engineer, the guilt washing over me like a cold wave. "I am sorry," I muttered, rubbing my temples, the throbbing headache settling behind my eyes. "Just run the diagnostic again. Take your time." I retreated to my office, shutting the door, leaning against the heavy wood. I was losing my grip, fighting a war on too many fronts. The prospectus arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later. I printed the glossy, fraudulent document, clutching the physical proof of his crime. I had the evidence I needed to sever the power of attorney. But presenting it to the authorities would trigger a massive public scandal. I needed to try one last desperate maneuver to handle the situation internally. I needed to confront Savannah. I hoped the golden child, faced with undeniable proof that her husband was a criminal, would align with me to save our parents. But the meeting I arranged at a noisy local restaurant would explode into a bitter public humiliation, cementing her loyalty to the parasite and forcing me to fight the legal battle entirely alone. The fraudulent prospectus sat on the passenger seat of my car, a glossy, colorful packet of absolute lies. Bradley promised high-yield returns on Permian Basin oil strikes, using complex financial jargon to mask the reality that the land was entirely dry. I had the proof. The next logical step was to confront Savannah. I assumed my sister, despite her vanity and entitlement, would side with our parents when presented with undeniable evidence of a massive financial crime. I texted her, requesting an urgent meeting at the local bank branch where my father held his primary accounts. I thought bringing her directly to the source of the bleeding would force her to face the severity of the situation. I arrived at the bank, a sprawling, modern facility situated in a busy commercial district in Southlake. I walked through the sliding glass doors, clutching the manila folder containing the prospectus and the offshore wire transfer logs. I expected to find Savannah waiting in the lobby. Instead, I walked straight into a coordinated defensive blockade. Savannah was not alone. She sat in a plush leather chair inside the branch manager's glass-walled office. Bradley sat beside her, his posture relaxed, his custom boots crossed at the ankle. They were both smiling, chatting amiably with the bank manager, a conservative, older man who had managed my father's accounts for over a decade. I froze in the doorway, the air conditioning suddenly feeling unnaturally cold. The bank manager looked up, offering a polite, professional nod. "Miss Charlotte, please come in. Your sister and brother-in-law were just explaining the situation regarding your father's medical emergency." Bradley turned his head, offering me a tight, victorious smirk. "Charlotte," he drawled his tone, dripping with fake concern. "We were just ensuring Richard's accounts are secure while he recovers. It is a stressful time for the family. We need to make sure his medical bills are covered without any delays." He was locking me out. He had anticipated my move. When I requested the prospectus pretending to be a naive investor, his paranoia triggered. He realized I was circling his financial operations, and he rushed to the bank to fortify his position. I ignored him stepping into the office and placing the manila folder directly onto the manager's desk. "I am here to request an immediate emergency fraud hold on Richard's primary accounts," I stated, my voice clipped and clinical. "I have evidence indicating unauthorized offshore wire transfers originating from his portfolio." Savannah stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. She wore a designer silk blouse and heavy diamond earrings, the armor of a woman desperately clinging to an illusion of wealth. "What are you doing, Charlotte?" she demanded, her voice rising shrill and accusatory. "You cannot just march in here and freeze Dad's money. Bradley is managing the investments." "Bradley is stealing the investments," I countered, turning to face her. "Savannah, I pulled the municipal logs. The oil leases he is selling do not produce. The land is dry. He is running a Ponzi scheme, and he is draining Dad's retirement to pay his federal tax attorneys." I expected horror. I expected tears. What I received was a fierce, aggressive defense of the very man who was ruining her. "You are a liar," Savannah shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You have always been jealous of us. You sit in your dark office, typing code, resenting the fact that Bradley is actually successful. You are making up wild accusations because you cannot stand that Dad trusts him more than he trusts you." I stared at her, the sheer density of her denial taking my breath away. "Savannah, I have the wire transfer logs," I pleaded, tapping the folder. "Look at the numbers. He moved $400,000 on Christmas Eve while Dad was having a stroke." Savannah refused to look at the folder. She crossed her arms, turning to the bank manager. "Do not Listen to her, she instructed, her tone imperious. She is acting out of pure spite because Mom yelled at her on Christmas. Bradley holds the legal authority. The bank manager cleared his throat, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He pushed my folder back across the desk. "I am sorry, Ms. Charlotte," he said, his voice measured and bureaucratic. "But Savannah is correct. Mr. Bradley holds a fully executed durable power of attorney. It was signed by your father and properly notarized 3 months ago. Under Texas law, he has the absolute right to manage, authorize, and transfer funds from these accounts unless you produce a court order nullifying that document. My hands are tied. I cannot freeze the assets based on an unverified accusation." The rigid, paper-heavy bureaucracy of Texas elder law slammed down like a steel door. A durable power of attorney is a bulletproof shield. The law designed to protect vulnerable adults from external fraud was currently protecting the predator living inside the house. "I cannot believe you are doing this," I whispered, staring at my sister. "He is robbing our parents blind, and you are helping him." "I am protecting my husband from a bitter spinster," Savannah sneered, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "Go back to your computer, Charlotte. Leave the real business to the men." The suffocating helplessness crushed the air from my lungs. I snatched the folder off the desk, turning on my heel and walking out of the office. I moved through the lobby in a daze, the ambient noise of the bank fading into a dull roar. The golden child had actively chosen the parasite over her own flesh and blood. I was entirely alone. What do you do when the man robbing your parents has the absolute legal right to do it, and your sister is standing guard at the vault? I burst through the glass doors, stepping out into the bright, unforgiving Texas sun. I power-walked to my car, the panic rising hot and fast in my throat. I reached the driver's side door, but my hands were shaking so violently, I dropped my keys onto the asphalt. The frustration, the exhaustion, the profound, isolating realization that the legal system was protecting the thief boiled over. I let out a raw, furious scream, echoing across the parking lot. I kicked the side of my own car, the heavy impact denting the metal door, leaving a scuff mark on the polished paint. I leaned against the warm metal, hyperventilating, gasping for air, trying to control the tears of sheer rage burning my eyes. Overturning a power of attorney requires a grueling, highly publicized investigation by Adult Protective Services. It involves proving the principal lacked capacity when the document was signed, a process that takes months. Bradley would drain the accounts dry long before a judge ever reviewed the case. The civil courts were too slow. I could not beat him in probate. I picked up my keys, my breathing slowly returning to a ragged baseline. If I could not use the civil courts to protect the money I had, to force a higher authority to intervene, I had to bypass the state bureaucracy entirely. I climbed into my car, a cold, surgical clarity replacing the panic. I was going to package the dry lease data, the fraudulent prospectus, and the offshore wire logs and submit them directly to the federal regulatory agencies. I was going to trigger a federal investigation that would freeze his assets globally. But Bradley, recognizing the lethal threat my $4 million company posed, would not wait for me to strike. He was about to launch a devastating bureaucratic sabotage against my life's work, forcing me to fight a terrifying two-front war. The confrontation at the bank verified one terrifying reality. Savannah was not a victim waiting to be rescued. She was an active, complicit shield protecting Bradley's fraudulent empire. I drove back to my corporate office, the adrenaline from the parking lot fading into a deep, exhausting dread. I knew I had to escalate the attack. I began compiling the digital evidence, the offshore wire logs, the fraudulent oil lease prospectus, and the geographical data proving the Permian Basin coordinates were dry scrubland. I prepared to bypass the slow, grinding machinery of the probate courts and deliver the package directly to the federal regulatory agencies. But Bradley was a predator who understood the mechanics of corporate warfare. He realized my $4 million supply chain software firm was not just a vanity project. It provided me with the liquid capital and the digital infrastructure required to dismantle his affinity scam. I was no longer the invisible domestic servant he could ignore. I was a lethal, heavily armed adversary. And in the aggressive good old boy networks of the Dallas corporate circles, adversaries are not reasoned with. They are suffocated. 3 days after the bank incident, my phone rang while I was reviewing the final code for the $2 million logistics contract I secured on Christmas Eve. The caller ID displayed Bradley's name. I let it ring twice, bracing myself for a verbal assault before answering. "Charlotte," he drawled, the smooth, confident cadence returning to his voice. "I am glad you picked up. I think we got off on the wrong foot at the bank. Emotions are running high with Richard in the hospital. I want to offer an olive branch. Let us meet for a drink tonight, just the two of us. We can discuss your concerns about the oil leases and find a compromise that protects the family." The offer was completely transparent, a slick, calculated attempt to gauge my next move. "I have nothing to discuss with you, Bradley," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. "The only compromise I will accept is your immediate resignation as the power of attorney and the full restitution of the funds you stole." Bradley chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent a chill down my spine. "That is a shame, Charlotte. I was hoping we could handle this quietly. But if you insist on playing hardball, you should probably check your corporate accounts. Enjoy the audit." He hung up. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, a sickening knot of panic twisting in my stomach. I swiveled my chair toward my secondary monitor and immediately logged into my primary business banking portal. The screen loaded, slowly, the loading wheel spinning an agonizing circle. When the dashboard finally appeared, a bright red banner spanned the top of the interface. "Account restricted, pending state regulatory review." My breath caught in my throat. I clicked furiously through the security alerts accessing the formal notification. Bradley had leveraged his network of shady corporate attorneys and fraternity connections within the state government. He filed a frivolous but meticulously constructed complaint with the Texas Comptroller, alleging my software firm was engaged in systemic tax evasion and fraudulent offshore accounting. He projected his own crimes onto my company, using the same offshore routing terminology I threatened him with. The complaint triggered an immediate aggressive state tax audit. My corporate accounts were frozen, pending the preliminary investigation. The operating capital required to pay my software engineers, maintain my servers, and execute the massive logistics contract was locked inside a bureaucratic vault. When your enemy attacks your life's work to protect his scam, do you back down or double down? Do you sacrifice the company you built to save your parents, or do you surrender the family to save your business? The panic was absolute and blinding. I had spent a decade building my firm, writing code until my fingers cramped, sacrificing relationships and sleep to ensure I would never depend on my mother's conditional approval. It was my identity. It was my fortress. And Bradley had just used a political favor to set it on fire. I was fighting a two-front war. I was trying to save my father's life savings from a parasite, while desperately trying to keep my own company from collapsing under the weight of bureaucratic sabotage. I stayed in my office until midnight, the empty building echoing with the hum of the servers. I called my corporate attorneys, demanding they file an emergency injunction to lift the restriction. But they warned me. The state audit process was sluggish and unforgiving. It would take weeks to clear my name. The financial strain on my business would be catastrophic. The stress fractured my usually clinical restraint. I walked into the small employee break room, pulling a bottle of cheap red wine from the back of the refrigerator left over from a previous office party. I did not bother with a glass. I drank straight from the bottle, the bitter liquid burning my throat. The alcohol amplified the fear, stripping away my logic. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing Bradley's number. It went to voicemail. "You think freezing my accounts is going to stop me?" I slurred my voice thick and trembling with panicked rage. You think a state audit scares me? I have the federal data, Bradley. I have the dry lease coordinates. I am going to burn your entire life to the ground. You are going to federal prison, and I am going to make sure Savannah goes down with you for defending you. I am going to destroy you. I ended the call, tossing the phone onto the break room table. The moment the screen went black, the liquid courage evaporated, replaced by a crushing, suffocating wave of regret. I had just sent a rambling, unhinged, threatening voicemail to a man actively building a case against my stability. I handed him an audio recording, proving I was acting out of vindictive malice, giving his lawyers the exact ammunition they needed to justify the frivolous complaint to the comptroller. I slumped into a plastic break room chair, burying my face in my hands. The invincible CEO, the strategic forensic auditor, had vanished. I was a terrified, exhausted woman making fatal tactical errors because the emotional toll of my family's betrayal was eroding my sanity. I needed to regain control. I needed to submit the federal evidence immediately before Bradley could launch another attack. But before I could finalize the package for the regulatory agencies, my mother would arrive at my house unannounced, delivering a confession that would force me to confront the devastating hidden history behind her lifelong cruelty, altering the entire emotional landscape of the war. The hangover the following morning was a brutal physical reminder of my tactical failure. I sat at my desk, drinking black coffee, trying to untangle the bureaucratic nightmare Bradley had unleashed on my company. My attorneys were working frantically to lift the state audit, but my operating capital remained frozen. I needed to shift my focus back to the federal reporting, bypassing the local corruption. But the emotional exhaustion was paralyzing. I packed my laptop and drove back to my house in Inman Park, desperate for a few hours of quiet isolation to strategize my next move. I unlocked the front door, dropping my keys on the console table. My house is a meticulously restored craftsman, a quiet sanctuary defined by clean lines and minimal clutter. I walked into the kitchen, stopping short. Sitting squarely in the center of my pristine granite island was a small, faded photograph. It was a picture I had salvaged from a box in my father's attic years ago, keeping it hidden in a desk drawer. The photograph depicted a rusted, dilapidated, single-wide trailer sitting on a barren patch of dirt. The harsh, desolate landscape of the West Texas Panhandle stretched out behind it, empty and unforgiving. It was a stark, violent contrast to the manicured lawns and massive estates of Southlake. It was the only existing photographic evidence of my mother's childhood. I must have pulled it out while searching for old bank records and forgotten to put it away. I reached for the photo, intending to hide it again, but the sound of the front door opening stopped me. I turned around, expecting to see David, my COO, stopping by with legal updates. Instead, Suzanne stood in the foyer. My mother looked terrible. The polished socialite who obsessed over unpolished silver was gone. She wore a simple dark sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, her face pale and devoid of makeup. She looked older, stripped of the armor she wore to face the world. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes locking onto the faded photograph resting on the island. She stopped tracing the edge of the granite counter with a trembling finger. She did not yell at me for leaving without permission. She did not demand an explanation for my hidden wealth. She just stared at the rusted trailer. "I ate mayonnaise sandwiches for dinner every night for 3 years," she whispered, her voice hollow-sounding like a frightened child. "That is all we had. The wind out there in the panhandle, it never stops blowing. It pushes the red dirt through the cracks in the windows until everything you own tastes like dust." I used to sit on the steps of that trailer watching the wealthy oil families drive past in their clean cars, and I promised myself I would never let the dirt touch me again. I stood paralyzed, the coffee cup growing cold in my hand. Suzanne had never spoken about her childhood. She had buried her origins beneath layers of country club memberships and designer clothes, projecting an illusion of generational wealth to mask the shame of her poverty. She looked up at me, her eyes pooling with tears. I know you hate me, Charlotte. I know you think I treated you like a servant. You think I favor Savannah because she is beautiful and compliant. But you do not understand. Savannah is fragile. She only knows how to look expensive. If the money disappears, she will drown. Suzanne took a ragged breath, stepping closer, her hands gripping the edge of the island. But you were always so smart, so capable. I forced you to cook. I forced you to clean and manage the house because I needed you to be useful. I believed that if you knew how to work, if you knew how to be indispensable, you would never starve. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was giving you the tools to survive when the money ran out. The confession hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The profound grief of her reality shattered the simple narrative I had constructed. Suzanne was not a cartoon villain obsessed with vanity. She was a deeply traumatized woman operating on pure survival instinct. She trusted Bradley because he projected the old money security she craved, an illusion that promised to keep the dirt away from her family. Her abuse was not born of malice. It was a twisted, desperate trauma response. Can you forgive a lifetime of abuse if you discover it was rooted in the desperate fear of starvation? Can you look at the mother who treated you like a maid and see the terrified 10-year-old girl eating mayonnaise sandwiches in a rusted trailer? The realization was agonizing. I wanted the narrative to remain simple. I wanted her to be the shallow antagonist and me to be the righteous victim. Accepting her flawed humanity, accepting that my childhood of domestic servitude was a warped expression of maternal love, required a level of emotional processing I was entirely unprepared to handle. The conflicting emotions boiled over into a sudden, violent outburst. I slammed my coffee cup onto the counter, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim. "You do not protect people by turning them into slaves," I yelled, my voice raw and echoing in the quiet kitchen. "You do not shield me from poverty by treating me like I am worthless. You let Bradley rob Dad blind because you were too busy polishing your fake image to see the monster standing in your living room. You let Savannah defend him. You let them freeze my company." I stepped around the island, pointing a shaking finger at the photograph. "I built a $4 million company, Suzanne. I built it in the dark while you were sleeping because I was terrified I would spend the rest of my life basting your holiday roasts. You did not teach me how to survive. You taught me that my only value was my labor." Suzanne flinched, covering her face with her hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob. She did not argue. She knew I was right, and the brutal delivery of my truth crushed whatever fragile hope she had left. "I am sorry," she wailed, sinking onto one of the kitchen bar stools, her shoulders shaking. "I am so sorry, Charlotte." I stood there, my chest heaving, the tears burning my eyes. I looked at my weeping mother, the woman who had sacrificed her own peace of mind to build a fragile illusion of safety. The messy reality of her trauma left me gutted, but the resentment I had harbored for 31 years was too deeply entrenched to simply wash away. "I cannot do this right now," I whispered, my voice dropping to a cold, exhausted rasp. "I am trying to save Dad's money and my own company. You need to leave." Suzanne nodded, slowly accepting the boundary. She stood up, wiping her face, taking one last look at the faded photograph before walking out the front door. The heavy wood clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent house. The emotional battlefield was littered with casualties, but the financial war still demanded a final, brutal execution. I could not rely on the slow civil courts to overturn Bradley's power of attorney. I had to pivot my focus back to the federal evidence, packaging the dry lease data and the offshore wire logs for a surgical strike. But pulling the trigger on a federal investigation would require me to make a devastating choice, risking the permanent destruction of my sister's life to secure the survival of my parents. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the faded photograph of the rusted West Texas trailer My mother's confession hung in the quiet air of my home. The revelation of her childhood trauma explained her cruelty, but it did not change the immediate danger threatening my father's survival. Empathy could wait. Justice required action. Texas elder law courts are notoriously sluggish. To overturn a signed, durable power of attorney, a plaintiff must prove the principal lacked mental capacity at the exact moment of signing. That process demands psychiatric evaluations, medical subpoenas, and endless preliminary hearings. The probate system moves like a slow glacier. Bradley would empty the remaining retirement accounts long before a civil judge even reviewed my petition. I could not beat him in a local courtroom where his slick lawyers knew how to exploit every procedural delay. I needed an arena where his Dallas fraternity connections held zero influence. I returned to my home office and booted up my primary workstation. My supply chain software firm tracks complex physical commodities across global networks. I took the raw geographical data Bradley used to sell his fake oil leases in the Permian Basin and ran it through advanced satellite imaging protocols. The results were stark and undeniable. The coordinates he provided to his investors pointed to barren dirt. There were no drilling rigs, no pump jacks, no active pipelines. He was selling shares of dry dust. In this state, you do not play games with energy resources. The Texas Railroad Commission is the deeply feared regulatory body governing all oil and gas operations within state lines. Despite their historical name, they control the lifeblood of the regional economy. They possess sweeping authority to halt operations, issue staggering fines, and refer criminal fraud directly to state prosecutors. They do not tolerate unlicensed drilling or phantom leases. I compiled the geographical proof of his empty wells. Then, I paired it with the offshore wire transfer logs I intercepted on my flight to Miami. The combination elevated his crime from a local scam to interstate wire fraud. That specific escalation placed him directly in the crosshairs of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I packaged the digital dossier, encrypting the files into a secure folder. I opened an anonymous reporting portal for the federal agencies attaching the evidence. The cursor hovered over the submit button. The glow of the monitor cast long shadows across my office walls. My hand trembled. If I sent this package, the response would not be a polite civil summons. It would be a coordinated federal raid. Bradley would lose his freedom, but the blast radius would be devastating. Savannah was his legal spouse. Her name was likely attached to his holding companies. She had defended him at the bank insulting me to protect her lavish lifestyle. If the federal agents froze his assets, they would freeze hers. Her designer clothes, her luxury vehicles, her entire identity would evaporate overnight. She might even face criminal scrutiny for complicity. Would you pull the trigger on a federal investigation if you knew the collateral damage would ruin your sister's life? Would you initiate a sequence of events that guarantees your own sibling will face public humiliation and potential legal ruin just to stop a thief? I sat in the dark for 3 agonizing hours. I drank cold, stale coffee and paced the hardwood floors. My stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. I pictured Savannah at the Tex-Mex restaurant, throwing my warnings back in my face, calling me a jealous spinster. Then I pictured my father lying in the intensive care unit, his brain damaged by the relentless terror of losing his home to the man my sister was protecting. The choice was brutal, but it was clear. I could not save someone who fought for the right to be scammed, not when it meant sacrificing the innocent victims caught in the crossfire. I walked back to my desk, took a deep breath, and clicked the mouse. The encrypted dossier vanished into the federal servers. The regulatory hammer was officially suspended in the air, waiting for the bureaucrats to verify the coordinates and secure their warrants. Federal investigations require time. Agents build airtight cases before they strike. I needed to ensure Bradley remained complacent while the trap was primed. If he sensed danger, he would transfer the remaining stolen funds into untraceable cryptocurrency or flee the jurisdiction entirely. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for his lead corporate attorney. The lawyer answered with a clipped, arrogant tone. I modulated my voice, stripping away the confident edge of a chief executive officer. I forced myself to sound exhausted, defeated, and overwhelmed by the state tax audit Bradley had weaponized against my company. I told the attorney my business operating capital was drying up, and I could no longer sustain a two-front war. I requested a formal mediation meeting for the following week, hinting that I was prepared to negotiate a global settlement. I implied I would drop my challenges to the power of attorney if Bradley lifted the bureaucratic freeze on my software firm. The lawyer took the bait eagerly, promising to arrange the meeting. Bradley's ego would not allow him to refuse a public surrender. He wanted to sit across a boardroom table and watch me fold. The fake mediation bought me the necessary time for the federal agents to review my data. The trap was set, but a glaring vulnerability remained. The federal asset freeze would eventually stop Bradley, but my father's stolen retirement funds were already sitting in offshore accounts dangerously out of reach. If the government seized those accounts, the money could be tied up in litigation for a decade, leaving my parents destitute. I needed to lure that specific cash back onto domestic soil before the indictments dropped. I had to convince a paranoid, greedy predator to willingly transfer his stolen money into a secure American vault. To accomplish this, I would have to orchestrate a high-stakes corporate deception, offering Bradley the one irresistible asset his fragile ego desperately craved, setting the stage for a boardroom confrontation that would seal his fate. The federal reporting portal confirmed receipt of my encrypted dossier, but confirmation is not action. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Texas Railroad Commission move with deliberate, lethal precision. I knew they would secure warrants, but I also knew the timeline was unpredictable. While I waited for the government machinery to grind forward, the most critical piece of the puzzle remained unsecured. The offshore accounts holding my father's stolen retirement funds were virtually untouchable. If the feds raided Bradley's office tomorrow, the offshore cash could be frozen in international litigation for years, leaving my parents bankrupt. I needed to claw that money back into a domestic jurisdiction immediately. I needed to trick a professional con artist into willingly surrendering his stolen capital. Bradley operated in the slick, glass-paneled, high-rise offices of downtown Dallas, a vertical ecosystem where corporate invincibility is projected through corner suites and aggressive acquisitions. He viewed himself as an apex predator in the real estate market, despite his actual holdings being nothing but dry scrubland in the Permian Basin. His ego was his defining characteristic. He desperately craved the legitimacy of a tangible, cash-flowing asset to mask his failing oil leases. I decided to weaponize that exact vulnerability against him. I arranged a preliminary meeting at his Dallas office, operating under the guise of our impending mediation. I did not wear the tailored suits I typically reserved for client presentations. I dressed in a rumpled blouse, my hair pulled into a messy knot, projecting the image of a stressed, overwhelmed small business owner buckling under the weight of the state tax audit he had orchestrated. I walked into his corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Dallas skyline. Bradley sat behind a massive mahogany desk, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked incredibly smug, his custom boots propped casually on a stack of files. Savannah was not present. This was a corporate battlefield, and he intended to savor his perceived victory alone. Charlotte, he purred, a slick, patronizing smile spreading across his face. I am glad you finally saw reason. Fighting the state comptroller is an expensive hobby. I assume you are ready to drop your objections to my power of attorney and let me handle Richard's affairs in peace? I sat down in the low visitor chair, deliberately positioning myself as the subordinate. Yes, Bradley, I replied, my voice tight, attempting to mimic the exhausted resignation I felt just days ago. The audit is draining my operating capital. But simply dropping my objections will not save my firm. I need a rapid injection of cash to satisfy my payroll obligations and clear the state restrictions. His smile widened. I am not a charity, Charlotte. If your little software company is failing, that is a management issue. It is not failing, I countered, leaning forward, injecting a note of desperate urgency into my tone. My supply chain software just identified a massive, distressed logistics warehouse near the Fort Worth Alliance Airport. The current owners are defaulting on their commercial mortgage. The property is deeply undervalued, but it sits directly on a primary distribution route. If acquired and optimized using my logistics tech, it will generate a 7-figure monthly return within 6 weeks. Bradley lowered his boots, his predatory instincts suddenly engaged. He leaned over the desk, the smugness replaced by sharp, calculating greed. Why are you telling me this? Because the state froze my corporate accounts, I said, meeting his gaze, playing the defeated sister perfectly. I have the data identifying the asset, but I lack the liquid capital to execute the down payment. You manage Dad's portfolio. The accounts still hold over $500,000. I am offering you a joint venture. You use Dad's remaining cash to secure the down payment on the warehouse. In exchange, I will structure the holding company to grant you a 50% ownership stake in the logistics center. You gain a highly lucrative, legitimate commercial asset. I get the capital injection I need to survive the audit. It was an irresistible piece of bait. Bradley was bleeding cash, hiding dry oil wells and fending off angry investors. The opportunity to secure a legitimate, cash-flowing commercial warehouse in the booming Dallas-Fort Worth logistics corridor, using stolen money, was a lifeline he could not ignore. It offered him the perfect cover story, a solid, tangible asset to present to anyone questioning his financial stability. "Let me see the prospectus," he demanded, holding out a manicured hand. I unzipped my leather tote bag, pulling out a thick binder containing the geographical data and the projected revenue models for the warehouse. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The warehouse was real. The data was accurate. The only fiction was my intention to finalize the partnership. I was handing him a meticulously crafted bomb. Would you hand your enemy a lucrative real estate deal if you knew the paperwork was rigged with explosives? Would you sit across a desk from the man destroying your family and smile while he signed his own death warrant? My hand trembled violently as I passed the binder across the mahogany desk. The sheer adrenaline of the deception threatened to overwhelm my physical control. My shaking fingers caught the edge of my paper coffee cup resting near my bag. The cup tipped, spilling hot, dark liquid across the corner of the financial projections. I gasped, snatching a napkin to dab at the spreading stain, my face flushing with genuine, panicked heat. The clumsy error was real, but it played perfectly into my crafted persona. I looked like a terrified, erratic amateur, losing her grip under the pressure of high-stakes negotiation. Bradley laughed a cold, dismissive sound, watching me blot the coffee. "Relax, Charlotte," he sneered, pulling the binder away from the damp napkin. "You clearly do not have the stomach for this level of acquisitions. Leave the heavy lifting to me. I will review the models. If the numbers check out, we will draft the partnership agreements." I nodded mutely, gripping the arms of my chair to hide the lingering tremors in my hands. The bait was taken. His arrogance blinded him to the structural trap hiding in the fine print. To finalize a commercial real estate purchase of this magnitude, the initial down payment must be transferred into a secure domestic escrow account managed by an independent legal firm. By agreeing to the deal, Bradley was committing to wire my father's stolen retirement funds out of his untraceable offshore accounts and directly into a highly regulated American vault controlled by my attorneys. The money would be locked the moment it hit the escrow ledger. He would never see the warehouse. But while the federal agencies verified my data and the escrow trap slowly tightened, I would have to endure a grueling psychological waiting game, forced to play the obedient, defeated sister at public family gatherings, while Bradley paraded his fraudulent victory, ensuring he remained entirely complacent until the guillotine finally dropped. The wire transfer from Bradley's offshore shell company hit the domestic escrow account on a Tuesday morning. My corporate attorneys immediately confirmed the deposit, locking the stolen $500,000 behind an impenetrable wall of legal covenants. The funds were secure. The trap was armed. But the most grueling phase of the operation was just beginning. Federal investigations do not operate on the timelines of cinematic revenge. The SEC and the Texas Railroad Commission require weeks of meticulous data verification, cross-referencing satellite imagery with filed tax returns, before a judge will sign a warrant. I had to wait for the bureaucratic machinery to grind forward, and during that agonizing window, I had to ensure Bradley suspected absolutely nothing. To maintain the illusion of my total defeat, I was forced to re-enter the social orbit I had so dramatically abandoned on Christmas Eve. 2 weeks after the escrow transfer cleared, my mother organized a Sunday family luncheon at the Dallas Country Club. Richard was still recovering, and especially Anne desperate to project an image of familial stability to her peers. The brunch culture at these Dallas institutions is an aggressive, performative theater where status is communicated through subtle jewelry choices and loud conversations about real estate acquisitions. It was a suffocating environment under normal circumstances. Under the current parameters, it was pure psychological torture. I arrived at the club wearing a conservative, subdued dress, intentionally playing the part of the humbled daughter whose $4 million company was currently paralyzed by a state audit. The dining room buzzed with the clinking of fine crystal and the low murmur of affluent gossip. I spotted my family at a corner table overlooking the manicured greens of the 18th hole. Bradley sat at the head of the table, radiating the obnoxious confidence of a man who believed he had outsmarted everyone in the room. He wore a crisp linen blazer, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist every time he lifted his mimosa. Savannah sat beside him, dripping in designer labels, her pristine facade fully restored. She looked completely insulated from the financial rot her husband was actively managing. How do you smile at the parasite destroying your family when you know federal agents are currently reading his hard drives? How do you swallow your pride and endure the condescension when the power to annihilate them sits quietly in an encrypted folder on your laptop? I took my seat, forcing a tight, polite smile. Bradley leaned back, regarding me with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Charlotte," he drawled, lifting his glass in a mock toast, "it is good to see you getting out of the house. I know the state audit has been stressful, but do not worry. Once our logistics warehouse deal closes next week, the cash flow will get you back on your feet. It takes a certain level of corporate expertise to navigate these rough patches. I am glad you finally reached out for help." I gripped the linen napkin in my lap, my fingernails digging into my palms. "Thank you, Bradley," I replied, my voice flat and hollow. "I appreciate the guidance." Savannah let out a soft, dismissive laugh, buttering a warm biscuit. "I told you so, Charlotte," she murmured, refusing to make eye contact. "I told you sitting in your dark office typing code would not teach you how the real world operates. You should have let Bradley manage your investments from the start. He just closed another massive oil lease in the Permian last week. We are looking at summer homes in Cabo." The sheer audacity of her delusion struck me like a physical blow. She was bragging about dry dust. She was planning luxury vacations funded by the very retirement accounts her husband had drained from our incapacitated father. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. I reached for my mimosa, draining half the glass in a single burning swallow. The alcohol hit my empty stomach, sending a rapid, anxious flush across my chest. I watched Bradley signal the waiter, ordering a $100 bottle of champagne to celebrate his fictitious victories. He was parading his triumph, flaunting the wealth he had stolen, while I sat there, biting my tongue, forced to absorb the humiliation to protect the integrity of the federal sting. The tension coiling in my neck became unbearable. I poured a second glass of champagne from the bottle the waiter placed on the table, drinking it faster than the first. The liquid courage eroded the rigid, clinical restraint I had maintained for weeks. I looked at Savannah, her diamond earrings catching the light as she casually dismissed my entire life's work as a failed hobby. A sharp, dangerous anger flared in my throat. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, the words threatening to spill out of my mouth. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to shatter her pristine Buckhead illusion right there in the middle of the country club. I wanted to scream that her husband was a fraud, a criminal who had forged her name on failing business loans, placing her directly in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. I wanted to wipe the smug, arrogant grin off Bradley's face and tell him the escrow account was a vault designed to starve him. The words were on the tip of my tongue, trembling behind my teeth. But a sudden, clear image of my father, lying in the hospital bed, unable to speak, flashed in my mind. If I blew my cover now, Bradley would realize the warehouse deal was a trap. He would flee the jurisdiction entirely, leaving my parents destitute and my sister legally responsible for his massive debts. I could not sacrifice the war to win a petty argument over brunch. I shoved my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished floor, interrupting Savannah mid-sentence. "Excuse me," I muttered, my voice thick with suppressed rage. "I need to use the restroom." I did not wait for a response. I turned and power-walked through the dining room, navigating the maze of linen-covered tables, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I burst through the heavy oak doors of the ladies' room, locking myself inside a marble stall. I leaned against the cold tiled wall, gasping for air, the adrenaline and champagne mixing into a nauseating cocktail. I stayed in the bathroom for 20 minutes, gripping the edge of the porcelain sink, staring at my flushed reflection in the mirror. I forced myself to practice deep, tactical breathing, slowly rebuilding the fractured walls of my composure. I had to endure the humiliation. I had to let them believe I was broken. The waiting game was a psychological torture test, but the finish line was finally approaching. When I returned to the table, my expression was blank, the rebellious daughter safely tucked back into the shadows. I endured the rest of the luncheon, absorbing their subtle jabs and condescending advice without a single reaction. I let them savor their hollow victory, knowing it was the last peaceful meal they would ever share. The following week, Bradley would walk into a downtown boardroom expecting to sign the final paperwork for a lucrative warehouse acquisition. But the documents waiting for him on the polished mahogany table would not secure his financial future. They would deliver a shockwave that would obliterate his fake empire in a matter of seconds, triggering a horrifying realization for the golden child that would shatter her identity forever. The 3 weeks following the country club luncheon dragged by with an agonizing, crawling pace. I spent my days managing my software firm through alternative channels, isolating my key operations from the state tax audit Bradley had weaponized against me. The waiting game was a masterclass in psychological endurance, but the payoff arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. I received a brief encrypted message from the lead investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The warrants were signed, the coordinates were verified, the raid was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I immediately contacted Bradley's legal team. I arranged for the final signing of the logistics warehouse acquisition to take place at my corporate attorney's office in downtown Dallas, precisely at 2 o'clock on Thursday. The timing was critical. I needed Bradley sitting across a boardroom table, arrogant and isolated, while the federal agents simultaneously breached the doors of his fraudulent oil and gas headquarters across town. I ensured he would attend by dropping a final, irresistible piece of bait. During a brief phone call verifying the appointment, I adopted a conspiratorial tone, subtly implying that my supply chain software could easily obscure the financial origins of the capital used to purchase the warehouse. I hinted that the new holding company would provide the perfect opaque structure to absorb the liabilities of his struggling Permian Basin leases. The promise of a massive, high-tech money laundering operation was the ultimate lure for a desperate man. Thursday arrived, bringing a sharp, clear winter sky to the city. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany table in a sleek, glass-paneled boardroom on the 40th floor of an office tower. The view offered a sprawling, aggressive panorama of the Dallas skyline, a testament to corporate invincibility. Bradley walked into the room exactly at 2 o'clock. He did not bring his lawyers. He assumed this was a routine signing a final formal surrender by his defeated sister-in-law. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, projecting the hyper-masculine posturing native to Texas corporate culture. He offered a heavy, firm handshake to my attorney before taking his seat, loosening his silk tie with a practiced, casual ease. "Well, Charlotte," he drawled, leaning back in the plush leather chair, resting his boots on the lower rung of the table. "I reviewed the final contracts your team sent over. The structure is sound. The escrow transfer cleared on my end. I am glad you realized my corporate expertise was the only way to salvage your failing firm. We are going to make a lot of money together." The dramatic irony hung heavy and suffocating in the quiet room. He sat there, basking in his perceived victory, completely oblivious to the fact that his expertise had just locked him in a federal cage. I looked at the sleek, expensive pen resting beside the thick stack of acquisition documents. I did not pick up the pen. When you finally trap the parasite, do you gloat, or do you watch them suffocate in silence? Do you deliver a dramatic, cinematic speech, or do you simply let the terrifying reality of the paperwork do the talking? I remained perfectly still, my face a rigid mask of clinical detachment. "I am not signing the documents, Bradley," I stated, my voice flat, echoing off the glass walls. Bradley frowned, his smug smile faltering slightly. "What are you talking about? We agreed to the terms. The down payment is sitting in the escrow account. If you back out now, you lose the warehouse, and your firm goes under." "The firm is fine," I replied, folding my hands on the table. "The state audit was a nuisance, but my core assets were always protected. The warehouse acquisition was a fiction, Bradley. There is no joint venture. There is no logistics center." His boots dropped from the table, landing heavily on the carpet. The confusion in his eyes morphed rapidly into a dark, menacing anger. "You are playing games, Charlotte," he hissed, leaning forward, placing his hands flat on the mahogany surface. "You think you can bait me into a fake deal to waste my time? I will wire the funds back to my accounts right now and leave you to rot." "You cannot wire the funds back," I said, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "The escrow account is managed by my attorneys. The moment your offshore wire transfer cleared, they filed an emergency injunction locking the vault. The $500,000 you stole from my father is permanently frozen. You cannot touch a single dime." The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. "You stole my money," he sputtered, the arrogant southern drawl vanishing entirely. "I did not steal anything." I countered, reaching into my leather portfolio. "I recovered stolen property. I ran the geographical data on your Permian Basin leases, Bradley. The coordinates point to dry dirt. You are running an interstate wire fraud scheme. You drained a dying man's retirement account to float a massive Ponzi scheme and pay your federal tax attorneys." I pulled a stack of formal documents from the portfolio, dropping them onto the center of the table. The bold black seals of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Texas Railroad Commission were clearly visible on the cover pages. "I submitted the data 3 weeks ago." I continued, watching the absolute terror dawn in his eyes as he recognized the federal insignias. "I synced the timing of this meeting perfectly. While you are sitting here arguing about fake warehouses, federal agents are currently executing search warrants at your primary offices. They are seizing your servers, your hard drives, and your physical assets. You are not a real estate titan, Bradley. You are a broke, exposed criminal." He stared at the federal notices, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The polished, untouchable executive shattered, revealing a desperate, cornered animal. He lunged across the table, his hands scrambling to gather the documents, attempting to snatch a copy of the durable power of attorney resting near my portfolio. He thought he could somehow destroy the evidence of his control over my father's accounts. The sight of his hands on the document that had paralyzed me for months triggered a sudden, feral aggression. The calm, clinical restraint I had maintained evaporated. I reached across the table, grabbing his wrist with one hand and snatching the heavy parchment from his grip with the other. My movement was so violent and abrupt that the corner of the legal document tore, leaving a jagged piece of paper in his trembling fingers. "Do not touch my property," I snarled, my voice raw and unhinged, the years of domestic servitude and silent resentment boiling over in a single, furious moment. "Your power of attorney is void the minute the federal indictment drops. You are going to prison, and you are going to lose everything." Bradley stumbled backward, falling heavily into his leather chair, his chest heaving as the reality of his total annihilation set in. He was trapped, locked in a high-rise boardroom with no leverage, no cash, and no escape. The trap had snapped shut with flawless surgical precision. But the devastation I had engineered was about to expand beyond the parasite. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were about to swing open, delivering a horrifying collateral consequence that would force my sister to confront the agonizing truth about the man she married, shattering her entire identity in front of my eyes. Bradley sat slumped in the leather boardroom chair, staring blankly at the torn corner of the power of attorney still clutched in his trembling fingers. The suffocating silence of total defeat filled the sleek, glass-paneled room. The federal raid was executing exactly as planned, dismantling his physical operations while I held him captive in the financial snare. I had secured my father's stolen retirement funds in an impenetrable escrow vault. The primary objective was achieved, but the true cost of neutralizing a parasite is the inevitable damage inflicted upon the host. I had ensured the host would arrive exactly when the reality of the infection became undeniable. 2 hours prior to the boardroom confrontation, I instructed my corporate attorney to send a formal, highly sensitive notice of liability directly to Savannah's personal email address. I knew she spent her afternoons browsing the luxury boutiques of Highland Park, projecting the flawless image of an affluent Dallas wife. I also knew that receiving a digital legal summons outlining severe federal financial exposure would instantly shatter that curated peace. I wanted her to rush to the office, demanding an explanation from the husband she so fiercely defended at the bank. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open, hitting the wall with a loud, violent crack. Savannah stood in the threshold, her chest heaving, gasping for air. The abrupt, humiliating transition from a high society shopping spree to a hostile legal environment was written plainly across her panicked face. She wore a designer silk blouse and heavy diamond earrings, but her immaculate blowout was a mess, and she had dropped her expensive leather handbag somewhere in the hallway. She did not look at me. Her wide, terrified eyes locked immediately onto Bradley. "What did you do?" Savannah shrieked, her voice breaking the refined Buckhead accent, dissolving into raw, primal panic. "What did you do to my name, Bradley?" Bradley flinched, shrinking deeper into the leather chair, refusing to meet her gaze. He stared at the polished mahogany table, his silence a damning confession. Savannah rushed forward, slamming her hands onto the table. "I was at the house," she sobbed, tears tracking fast and hot through her makeup. "I was pulling into the driveway, and there were black SUVs blocking the gate. Men in windbreakers walking out of our front door, carrying boxes. They took the keys to my car, Bradley. The FBI took my car. They told me the house is being seized. They handed me a warrant." Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch, echoing off the glass walls. They told me I am the primary guarantor on 3 commercial loans for the Permian Basin leases. They said I signed the documents. I never signed any commercial loans. You told me those were tax forms for the new holding company. You forged my signature to secure federal funding for empty dirt. The revelation hit me with a cold, sickening clarity. The forensic audit had exposed the dry leases and the offshore accounts, but Bradley's depravity extended far beyond robbing his father-in-law. He knew his Ponzi scheme was a fragile house of cards destined to collapse. To insulate himself from the inevitable federal blowback, he had actively, systematically transferred the legal liability of his fraudulent loans onto his own wife. He used Savannah's pristine credit and her blind, trusting vanity as a human shield. He didn't just lie to her about his wealth. He legally bound her to his federal crimes. She was not just broke. She was the designated fall guy facing terrifying federal scrutiny. Savannah turned to me, her face contorted in a mask of absolute devastation. The golden child, the woman who had happily let me slave over holiday meals while she posed for photographs. The sister who had publicly defended the man robbing our parents was standing in the ruins of her entire identity. Her luxury life was a mirage, funded by our parents' stolen retirement and fraudulent loans in her name. "Charlotte," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a desperate, pathetic whisper, "please, you have to help me. I did not know, I swear I did not know what he was doing. They are going to arrest me. I am going to prison. You are smart with this money stuff. You can fix this. Please." How do you comfort a sibling when their entire identity was built on a calculated financial scam and they are facing federal prison? Do you wrap your arms around them, offering unconditional sanctuary? Or do you demand they acknowledge the brutal consequences of their own willful ignorance? I looked at my weeping sister, the diamond earrings trembling against her jawline. I should have felt an overwhelming protective empathy. I should have assured her I would hire the best defense attorneys in Texas to untangle her from his fraud. But the resentment I harbored for the Christmas Eve humiliation, the anger over her complicity at the bank, and the sheer exhausting burden of being the family's invisible savior blocked my compassion entirely. The clinical, ruthless CEO took control. "I told you he was a fraud, Savannah," I said, my voice flat, cold, and completely devoid of emotional grace. "I sat across from you at that restaurant and handed you the proof. I told you he was draining Dad's accounts, and you called me a jealous spinster. You told me to leave the real business to the men. You defended the parasite because you cared more about keeping your designer shoes than protecting your own father." Savannah flinched, stepping backward as if I had struck her physically. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks, but she did not argue. She knew I was right, and the harsh, unforgiving delivery of my truth crushed whatever fragile hope she had carried into the room. "I am not your maid anymore," I continued, leaning forward, resting my hands on the table. "I am not going to clean up this mess for you. You signed the documents. You chose to look the other way because the illusion was comfortable. This is the reality, Savannah. You are legally responsible for the monster you married." I turned away from her, ignoring her ragged sobs. Picking up my leather portfolio, I walked out of the boardroom, leaving my sister and her fraudulent husband trapped in the suffocating silence of their shared ruin. I had executed the trap flawlessly, recovering my parents' stolen funds and neutralizing the threat. But the impending federal hammer was about to drop, executing a slow, deliberate grind through the justice system that would finalize the destruction of my family's remaining stability, forcing me to confront the heavy, isolating cost of my ultimate financial victory. The month following the boardroom confrontation felt like moving through a slow-motion car crash. The federal justice system, operating out of the imposing brutalist architecture of the Earl Cabell Federal Building in downtown Dallas, does not move with cinematic speed. It grinds forward with a deliberate, methodical weight, crushing everything caught in its gears. The SEC and the Texas Railroad Commission meticulously audited the dry Permian Basin leases, validating the geographical data I had provided. They systematically dismantled Bradley's network of shell companies, freezing every domestic account connected to his name. The investigation yielded a swift, undeniable legal consequence regarding my father's stolen retirement. Because Bradley had utilized the durable power of attorney as the primary instrument to commit federal wire fraud, a probate judge immediately nullified the document. The revocation was absolute. The $500,000 I had baited Bradley into transferring to the secure domestic escrow account was formally released from the legal hold and safely returned to Richard's portfolio. My parents were insulated from total destitution. The primary objective was achieved. But Bradley's desperation to maintain his facade had driven him to commit a final, quiet betrayal that would shatter the remaining fragments of my mother's identity. During the asset seizure phase, federal agents cataloged the physical property located inside my parents' Southlake estate, attempting to identify any luxury items purchased with the stolen funds. An art appraiser was brought in to evaluate the contents of the house. Suzanne hovered nervously in the hallway, twisting the fabric of her sweater, watching the appraiser examine her prized possession, the Frederick Remington painting hanging above the console table. It was the centerpiece of her curated illusion, the ultimate symbol of the old money stability she desperately craved to mask her trailer park origins. The appraiser spent 5 minutes inspecting the canvas under a specialized light. He turned to my mother, his expression entirely neutral, and informed her the painting was a high-quality, modern forgery. Bradley had secretly removed the original Remington months ago, selling it through a private broker to cover a commercial margin call before he resorted to draining Richard's retirement accounts. He replaced it with a fake, assuming Suzanne was too blinded by the prestige of the object to notice the subtle differences in the brushstrokes. He stole her most valuable anchor to high society and used it to plug a hole in his sinking ship. When the news reached me, I did not feel a triumphant surge of vindication. The realization that my mother had spent her evenings meticulously dusting a worthless piece of canvas, a physical embodiment of the lies she chose to believe over her own daughter, struck me as profoundly, deeply sad. The Buckhead illusion was officially dead, eradicated by the very man she had welcomed into her home. The federal hammer finally dropped on a cold, rainy Tuesday in late January. Bradley was formally indicted on multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. The indictment was public, humiliating, and financially lethal. I decided to deliver the final execution myself. My $4 million supply chain software firm was thriving, operating efficiently despite the chaotic personal warfare I had waged for the last 2 months. I possessed significant liquid corporate capital, and I chose to utilize it for a highly targeted investment. The commercial property housing Bradley's sleek, glass-paneled downtown office was managed by a private holding company. The building was heavily leveraged, and the primary lender was eager to offload the distressed debt associated with Bradley's failing corporate lease. I used my tech company to legally purchase the distressed debt outright. I bought the commercial note, becoming the primary creditor and effectively the landlord of the very building where Bradley had confidently planned my demise. I did not send a proxy. The afternoon the federal indictment was unsealed, I drove to downtown Dallas, navigating the aggressive corporate traffic. I walked into the lobby of his office tower carrying a single manila folder. I bypassed the receptionist, marching directly to his corner suite. Bradley was packing a cardboard box, his custom boots scuffed, his tailored suit wrinkled. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the walls of his cage were finally closing in. I dropped the manila folder onto his desk. He stared at it, refusing to pick it up. "I am your landlord now, Bradley," I stated, my voice flat and clinical, echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I bought the debt on this building yesterday. That folder contains your formal eviction notice. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises before I call building security to physically remove you." He looked at me, the arrogant southern drawl utterly extinguished. "You destroyed my life," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You built a house on dry dirt," I countered, turning my back on him. I just pulled the fire alarm. I walked out of the office, leaving him standing in the ruins of his hubris. The financial guillotine had dropped, severing the parasite completely. The war was over. I had won. I drove back to my corporate headquarters, locking myself inside my private office. The building was quiet, the software engineers having left for the day. I walked over to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out a bottle of cheap bourbon left over from a forgotten office party. I did not bother with a glass. I unscrewed the cap and drank straight from the bottle, the harsh liquid burning a path down my throat, settling hot and heavy in my empty stomach. What does ultimate financial victory feel like when the cost is detonating your own family's stability? Do you feel the righteous satisfaction of a victorious general, or do you just feel the cold, isolating silence of the battlefield? I slumped into my ergonomic chair, staring blankly at the glowing monitors. I had recovered my father's retirement. I had evicted the monster. But the collateral damage was devastating. Savannah was destitute, facing months of grueling legal battles to clear her name from the identity theft. My mother was sitting in a house stripped of its defining illusions, forced to confront the terrifying reality of her past. I had saved my family by systematically destroying the very foundation they had built their lives upon. A raw, ragged sob tore through my chest, shattering the clinical stoicism I had maintained for weeks. I cried alone in my dark office, mourning the sister who had defended her abuser, mourning the mother who valued a fake painting over her own flesh and blood. The victory was absolute, but the emotional toll was a heavy, suffocating weight I would have to carry alone. The financial execution was complete, but the emotional reconstruction of the shattered survivors was about to begin, forcing me to navigate a sudden, unexpected shift in my father's condition that would challenge the rigid boundaries I had established forever. The hangover the following morning was a brutal physical manifestation of the emotional wreckage I had engineered. I sat at my desk, drinking black coffee, the glow of the monitors searing my tired eyes. The federal indictment was public record. Bradley was ruined. The financial war was over, but the silent, desolate aftermath was far more difficult to navigate than the active combat. I had severed the parasite, but the host was still bleeding. January arrived in North Texas, bringing a mild, unpredictable weather pattern typical of the region. A sharp, clear sky stretched across the Dallas metroplex, the air crisp and biting, holding the promise of a new year devoid of the suffocating humidity of the past months. It felt like a clean slate, but the emotional ledger of my family remained hopelessly unbalanced. Richard was transferred from the intensive care unit to an advanced neurological rehabilitation facility in Plano. The medical team confirmed that removing the chronic stress of the financial drain had stabilized his cardiovascular system. The microstrokes had ceased, allowing his brain to slowly begin repairing the damaged neural pathways. He was regaining his motor functions, and more importantly, he was slowly recovering his speech. I visited the facility twice a week, managing the administrative details of his care and finalizing the transfer of the recovered escrow funds back into his secure retirement portfolio. I did not engage in deep emotional conversations during these visits. I remained the clinical, efficient CEO, adopting the same detached professionalism I used to run my software company. I checked his charts, spoke with his physical therapists, and ensured the billing was handled seamlessly. I was protecting my parents, but I was operating from a very deliberate, safe distance. During a visit on a bright, chilly Tuesday afternoon, I found Richard sitting up in his hospital bed, staring blankly at a muted television screen. Suzanne was not there. She had retreated into a profound, quiet isolation since the revelation of the forged painting, rarely leaving the Southlake house. I walked into the room carrying a manila folder containing the finalized banking documents. I set the folder on the rolling tray table, positioning it directly in his line of sight. I wanted him to see the numbers. I needed him to understand the exact magnitude of the theft he had blindly authorized when he signed the power of attorney. "Here are the updated portfolios, Dad," I said, my voice flat, projecting a measured calm. "The escrow funds cleared this morning. The $500,000 Bradley wired offshore is back in your primary account. The federal authorities have frozen his remaining assets to cover the tax liens. You are solvent. The house is safe." Richard looked at the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the cover. He stared at the bold black numbers, the irrefutable proof of his near-total destruction and the subsequent rescue executed by the daughter he had treated as an afterthought. He closed the folder, resting his hands on the top of the manila envelope. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and surprisingly focused. The cognitive fog that had clouded his gaze for weeks was gone. "I am sorry, Charlotte," he said, his voice raspy and slow, but carrying a steady, undeniable weight. I froze, my hand hovering over the back of the visitor chair. I expected him to thank me for recovering the funds. I expected a generic expression of gratitude. I did not expect an apology. "Sorry for what I asked," the defensive armor immediately sliding into place. "Sorry for everything," he replied, taking a slow, measured breath. "The speech therapist told me stress caused the strokes. I knew the money was disappearing. I knew Bradley was aggressive, but I was too tired to fight him. I let him take control because it was easier than admitting I had failed to protect the family. I watched him drain the accounts, and I stayed quiet." He paused, his gaze dropping to his trembling hands. "And I watched your mother treat you like a servant for 10 years, he continued, the shame evident in his raspy voice. "I sat in the living room drinking bourbon while you cooked the meals and cleaned the house. I let her banish you from the holiday table because I did not want to argue with her. You saved us, Charlotte. You built an empire, and you saved us from living in the dirt, and I never once defended you. I am so deeply sorry." The confession hung in the sterile air of the rehabilitation room. It was the absolute, unvarnished truth. He had been a passive, cowardly observer, allowing his wife's trauma and his son-in-law's greed to dictate the narrative of our lives. He had sacrificed my emotional safety to protect his own peace. If the father who ignored your pain finally apologizes, is it enough to heal the wound? Can a sincere admission of guilt wash away a decade of quiet complicity? Richard reached out his hand, hovering over the edge of the hospital bed, offering a tentative, trembling olive branch. He wanted a hug. He wanted the physical reassurance that his apology was accepted, that the familial fracture was mending. I stared at his outstretched hand, the little girl inside me, the daughter who had desperately craved his approval, wanted to close the distance and bury her face in his shoulder. But the clinical CEO, the woman who had spent months fighting a vicious two-front war, remained firmly anchored to the floor. The apology was genuine, but it did not erase the 31 years of neglect. A single moment of clarity does not rebuild a crumbled foundation. I took a deliberate step backward, my boots scuffing softly against the linoleum floor. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets of my denim jacket, refusing the embrace. "I am glad you are recovering, Dad," I said, my voice tight, dropping to a quiet, exhausted whisper. "I will manage the portfolios. I will ensure the property taxes are paid and the medical bills are cleared. You and Mom will never have to worry about the finances again." I paused, looking directly into his eyes, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of my next words. "But I am never stepping foot in that kitchen again. I am never cooking another holiday meal. I will protect your assets, but I am done being the family maid." Richard slowly lowered his hand, resting it back onto the hospital blanket. He did not argue. He did not demand forgiveness. He nodded once, accepting the rigid, ironclad boundary I had just established. He understood that my protection came with a permanent emotional distance. I turned and walked out of the rehabilitation facility, stepping into the sharp, clear January air. The guarded acceptance settled over me, a strange, heavy peace. I had secured their survival, but I had officially resigned from my role as the invisible workhorse. The dynamic was permanently altered. But while my parents were learning to navigate the quiet isolation of their new reality, my sister was about to present a challenge that would test the very limits of my newfound boundaries, forcing me to decide if honest, grueling work could truly wash away the sins of a family obsessed with polished lies. The confrontation at the rehabilitation facility established the new perimeter of my life. I managed the financial fortifications, but I refused to re-enter the emotional battlefield. Winter slowly surrendered to the brutal, humid heat of a Texas spring, and the consequences of the federal indictment settled into the permanent public record. Bradley remained confined to a small apartment wearing a federal GPS ankle monitor, awaiting his trial date for interstate wire fraud and tax evasion. The commercial properties I had foreclosed on were liquidated, and the proceeds securely invested into my expanding corporate portfolio. The parasite was effectively neutralized. But the host was still bleeding. Savannah was technically safe from federal prosecution because my attorneys successfully proved Bradley had forged her signature on the commercial loans. However, the consumer debt remained. She was still legally responsible for the $80,000 in high-interest credit card debt she had accumulated, funding her fake Buckhead lifestyle. The designer wedding dresses, the lavish bridal shower deposits, the imported shoes, were all firmly anchored to her personal credit score. She was broke, living in her childhood bedroom, staring at a mountain of bills she had no capacity to pay. She assumed I would eventually write a check. She waited, expecting the invisible workhorse to clean up the mess with a single, massive wire transfer from my $4 million company. I did not write the check. I knew that handing Savannah a bailout before she understood the value of a single dollar would be catastrophic. She needed to learn how to generate real equity instead of relying on polished illusions. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, I drove to my parents' Southlake estate. I let myself in using the spare key, bypassing the formal living room where my mother sat, quietly reading. I walked straight upstairs to Savannah's bedroom. She was not there, but the room was a chaotic museum of her former life, littered with empty shopping bags and discarded designer clothes. I did not leave a check. I placed a thick stack of basic data entry manuals and a simple navy blue company polo shirt bearing my software firm's logo directly onto her unmade bed. I placed a small sticky note on top of the pile. Shift starts at 8 in the morning. Do not be late. It was a silent, challenging invitation. A choice between the comfortable delusion of her past and the grueling, honest reality I could offer her. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing code in my office, located deep within the gritty, fast-paced environment of the Dallas Design District. The area is a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of Buckhead, characterized by repurposed industrial warehouses, loud delivery trucks, and the frantic energy of tech startups. The caller ID displayed Savannah's name. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice flat and neutral. "Charlotte," she said, her voice lacking the melodic, confident cadence of the golden child. It sounded smaller, but remarkably steady. I read the manuals. I want the job. I need to pay off this debt, and I do not want Mom to take out another loan. The silence stretched in my office, the hum of the servers the only sound. "It is not glamorous, Savannah," I said, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "You will be sitting in a cubicle. You will be entering raw supply chain data for 8 hours a day. You will wear the company polo. I am not going to treat you like a princess on the payroll. You will earn an entry-level hourly wage until you prove you can handle the software." "I know," she replied without hesitation. I put the shirt on Charlotte. It fits. Can honest work wash away the sins of a family obsessed with polished lies? Can the physical, grueling labor of earning a paycheck teach a person how to rebuild their own shattered character? A week later, Savannah was sitting in a standard gray cubicle in the middle of my bullpen. She was not wearing her designer sunglasses or her heavy diamond earrings. She wore the navy blue polo, her hair tied back, her eyes focused entirely on the dual monitors in front of her. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumping under the repetitive weight of the data entry. But she was not complaining. She was not checking her phone or worrying about her reflection in the glass windows. She was typing furiously, observing the precise coding structures required to track global logistics. She was learning how to spot a weak foundation. She was learning how to build something real. We worked in the same building, separated by a few walls of glass and drywall. We were not fixing our relationship with long, emotional conversations or dramatic apologies. We were fixing it by simply sharing the weight of the work. For the first time in our lives, we were operating on equal ground. My relationship with Beatrice, however, remained a casualty of the war. My mother was living quietly in her massive, empty Southlake house, forced to face the true origins of her trauma without the distraction of a golden child's wedding. She no longer had an elite son-in-law to brag about at the country club. The illusion she had sacrificed her own integrity to maintain had evaporated, leaving her completely isolated. She called me twice a week, leaving tentative, hesitant voicemails, asking about my business and suggesting we grab coffee. I listened to the messages sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my own home, but I did not call her back. The imperfect, stubborn CEO still held the reins. I was holding on to residual anger, unable to fully forgive the mother who treated me like a servant to appease a monster. The boundary I established in the rehabilitation facility remained intact, rigid, and unforgiving. I was healing, but I was still deeply flawed, unready to offer complete absolution. 6 months passed. I stood in my corner office, wiping a streak of dust from my desk. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the brutal Texas sun set over the Dallas skyline. The city was a sprawling grid of neon and headlights, a testament to ambition and survival. I looked down into the bullpen, observing Savannah diligently logging out of her workstation, grabbing her modest purse, and heading for the elevator. She had paid off 20% of her debt. She was surviving the parasite. We had dismantled the fake empire and preserved my father's retirement. The emotional wreckage of my family was still scattered across the landscape, but the foundation we were building now, the bond forged in data entry and honest sweat, was finally solid. We were imperfect, we were bruised, and we were still learning how to navigate the cold draft of our history. But as the city lights flickered to life, reflecting off the glass panes of my office, I knew with absolute certainty that this foundation built on truth and not servitude would never crumble again. Looking back at that Christmas Eve, the Mary standing in the kitchen covered in beef blood and cracked pepper, the pain of my mother's screaming feels like a necessary, brutal catalyst. I often ask myself how a family can survive a betrayal orchestrated by the very people meant to provide sanctuary. We survived because I stopped trying to force my way into a dining room that was built on a crumbling lead, fraudulent foundation. I stopped apologizing for my success and realized my independence was my greatest asset. Navigating the wreckage of my family taught me 5 uncompromising truths about wealth, worth, and the toxic nature of conditional love. First, financial independence does not buy affection, but it buys the ultimate freedom to walk away from toxicity. Bradley and Beatrice believed my assumed domestic role made me vulnerable and unrefined. They failed to realize that the discipline required to build a $4 million software firm gave me the exact forensic resilience needed to dismantle their lies. You cannot extort someone who knows how to build their own fortress. Second, wealth in the hands of the insecure is a weapon they will inevitably use against themselves. Savannah's desire for a lavish lifestyle was entirely driven by her need to project elite status. By locking her into a cubicle and forcing my sister to learn the value of a single, hard-earned dollar, I didn't just help her pay off her debt, I saved her character. True financial security is meaningless without the emotional maturity to manage it. Third, a trauma response is an explanation, never an excuse. I finally understood that my mother's obsession with high society was a panicked reaction to her impoverished West Texas childhood. She pushed me to be useful, to protect me from the snobbery she endured. But understanding her pain does not require me to absorb her abuse. You can have profound empathy for the broken people who raised you, while firmly refusing to let them break you in return. Fourth, the loudest people in the room are usually hiding the deepest rot. Radley spent years projecting an image of invincible old money, mocking my perceived lack of ambition. His entire persona was a desperate, panicked distraction from his massive federal tax evasion. True power is quiet. It doesn't need to brag by the fireplace. It simply buys the debt of the person screaming the loudest. Fifth, and finally, stato a boundary is only as strong as your willingness to enforce it. I still do not answer my mother's phone calls. I am imperfect, holding on to residual anger, but I accept that complete forgiveness is not a requirement for peace. Protecting your peace sometimes means loving your family from a very deliberate, quiet distance. The Dallas skyline outside my window is bright and clear today. The storm washed the debris away, leaving a solid, clean foundation. I am no longer the invisible workhorse paying the price for the vanity of others. I am the architect of my own unshakable peace. If you are listening to this right now and you feel trapped playing the servant to a family obsessed with illusions, remember that you have the power to drop the apron. You can walk out the door and build your own empire in the sun. Thank you for joining me here on Sofia Told Stories. If my journey resonated with your own struggles, please drop a comment below and share the hardest boundary you ever had to draw. Do not forget to subscribe and join our growing community. Your peace is worth fighting for, and your story deserves to be heard. I will see you in the next one.